Today's presentation is from Dr. Eli Newberger, who is a member of our staff, a senior associate in medicine in the ambulatory division. He's a director of the Family Development Program and an assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He also, I found out, was the originator of the term Trauma X as he developed the first consultative program here at Children's Hospital in 1970 for the evaluation of child abuse. So I present to you Dr. Newberger.
Thanks very much, Cedric. Good day, everyone. The task of this lecture is to give you a sense of the great and compelling sweep of issues that pediatrics faces as we contend with child abuse and a series of related problems in the family in the present day. I thought that what would be of interest in this opening series of efforts to elevate the sensitivity and capacity for response of our staff, which goes along with, I would add, efforts by Mass Medical Society and the American Medical Association to try to more fully inform physicians about their roles and their obligations. To give you a sense of the lively and changing picture in this very interesting field, and it's actually quite timely to do this in the course of a presidential election campaign, because indeed the modern rediscovery of this age-old social problem began in the early 1960s, in part inspired by the idealism and the rhetoric of the civil rights movement and its impact on the American political discourse and on particular key individuals, most notably John Kennedy and the people around him. In fact, as one hears this fairly lame discussion in the present day about the family, or what the Republicans are calling family values, it's also well to reflect on the very much more serious discussion 3 decades ago as Kennedy and his people, in the course of the 1960 presidential campaign, were reflecting on the state of this country and resolving somehow to do better. But I digress. I want to point out, as I begin to delineate for you what seemed to me to be the key events with regard to the involvement of the profession of pediatrics with abused and neglected children and their families, that it was in 1962, with a publication in JAMA of a provocatively entitled article called The Battered Child Syndrome by Henry Kemp, a distinguished pediatrician at the University of Colorado Medical Center, and his colleagues, which stimulated an outpouring of editorial concern and expressions of interest in the problem of child abuse among the many medical professions and specialties. Indeed, it was this article, published in 1962, that stimulated the development of the statutory requirements, which now very much direct, and some would say, and you will see this in a particular children's hospital case that I'll present, confine pediatric practice. Kemp and colleagues' paper, in retrospect, I think has got to be seen as being of enormous influence as this country began in the 1960s to contend with child abuse. The lead agency for children in the federal government at that time, the Children's Bureau, convened a group of experts, and they, contemplating the state of knowledge on child abuse in 1962 and the following year, recommended that model laws be passed in which physicians were obliged by law to make case reports of child abuse to agencies of the state, empowered at least in theory to provide the prospect of rescue to children presumed to be in jeopardy in their homes. By 1966, every state had a child abuse reporting law, and indeed the Massachusetts current statute, Section 51A, in Chapter 119 of the General Laws of this state, oblige doctors to make case reports where they may suspect child abuse. The standard is, in the reporting law, that if you have, as a physician, reasonable cause to believe that a child is being abused or neglected, you are mandated or required by statute to make a case report. If you don't, the law contains in it $1,000 fine, and there's now as well an expanding body of malpractice law in which physicians who don't report cases of abuse, but when then subsequently a child may be re-injured, are vulnerable to being found liable for the child's subsequent injury, where the physician's failure to report can be seen as an intervening cause of the child's subsequent injury. And this has resulted in, as you might expect, some concern on the part of physicians about what it is that they're obliged to do and what might be the consequences that would accrue to them and to their patients, both for complying with the requirement to report and failing to do so. And I'll have more to say about that in reference to a particular case in just a few moments. But I want to, particularly given the clamor and the low level of discourse around family issues, or as it's so quaintly put, family values, return you for a moment, if I can, to that period in the interval 1955 to 1965, when this country was seized with a sense of compassion for people who were disadvantaged. Martin Luther King Jr., the great spokesman, ideologue, rhetorician of the civil rights movement, had an enormous influence on the way people characterized problems. And in John Kennedy's presidential campaign, and then subsequently as Kennedy came into office, there was much of King's idealism in his initial program. And in retrospect, I think it's worthy of note that the rediscovery of the age-old problem of child abuse by pediatricians came in this time. You may remember Kennedy's 1961 inaugural address. I think there are not a few people in the audience old enough to recall Kennedy in his overcoat, or rather in his coat but without an overcoat, on a cold day in Washington, D.C., unburdening himself of epiphany after epiphany, these wonderful concepts and hopes for a better America, notably contained, of course, in the most celebrated one of all, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This was a time of great concern for disadvantaged people and what one citizen might be able to do for another, and what might be the active role of government in easing the suffering of people who were disadvantaged. I point this out both to point out how the ground was propitious for the appearance in the JAMA of this important and influential article in this time, but also, and as well, that this was a period in which important governmental programs to favor child health and child development came into place. This was the time when Project Head Start was proposed, Title I programs for educationally disadvantaged poor children in the schools. Then subsequently, after Kennedy's assassination, the programs Medicare and Medicaid. But I also want to note that the times have changed mightily, and that where the presumption was at the time of the meeting of the Children's Bureau Expert Committee, that if doctors could be obliged by statute to report cases of child abuse to agencies of the state, then of course the resources would follow. Because if the public conscience was piqued by the situation of abused and neglected children, it followed that the agencies of the state would become competent to deal with their needs. To say that the times have changed would be woefully to understate the matter. Briefly, to summarize the intervening years subsequent to Johnson's decision not to run in the thick of the controversy around the Vietnam War, in the Nixon, the Carter, and most especially in the course of the Reagan and Bush years, has dramatically been transformed. And now when people are in trouble and when people are in need, not infrequently, not only are their needs not sufficiently respected and attended to, but very frequently our governmental responses are punitive and unhelpful. And this presents in the present day, now that we know very much more about the prevalence and the impacts of child abuse and the assembled social problems associated with them, some difficult contradictions in clinical practice, which will also be the focus of my remarks very shortly. Now, I want you to keep in mind both this recent and a longer historical perspective, because in my view, the ways that we have discovered this social problem have importantly to do with the constraints on our dealing with it in clinical practice. I want to start a series of slides with this depiction by the great English artist William Hogarth of the ravages of what he called, the ravages of alcoholism on what he called Gin Lane in London in 1751. Actually, let me just turn the light out here. I'm not quite sure I'm doing this correctly. If the projectionist could turn out this light, it would be helpful because I don't need it. Here you can see in a picture of architectural and human disarray, various artifacts of what now 2 centuries later we might call child abuse, broadly and narrowly conceived. Just a little bit of background to this. Gin was the drink of poor people in 18th century London. Barley, from which gin is distilled, was not taxed. By contrast, hops were, and there's a companion piece to this called Beer Alley, which shows more affluent people sitting around drinking beer with kids and animals obviously very much better cared for than you see here. Here in this poor neighborhood, separated by a barrier from a more affluent neighborhood with elaborated architecture and statuary on the buildings, you can see a rather impressive array of violent acts against children. For example, under one of the many symbolic signposts in Hogarth's etching, the one shaped like a coffin, presumably a coffin maker's shop, you can see a drunken man dancing through the courtyard, holding in his left hand a bellows and in his right hand a stake on which a child's body is impaled. In today's parlance, this would be considered child abuse, however narrowly you might care to define it. To the left, you can see weeping unattended an infant whose mother's body is being lowered into a coffin, presumably from the effects of too much to drink. This child is obviously not having its nurturing needs attended, and in today's language might be considered to be a victim of child neglect. Here's a mother pouring a presumably alcoholic beverage into a child's mouth. And then in the foregrounds of this picture, at the intersection of these brilliantly conceived diagonals which give this picture a tremendous amount of dramatic tension, you can see an infant tumbling from its mother's arms to the sidewalk outside the tavern called Gin Royale, one of the few intact structures in this panoply of chaos. This infant could strike the pavement in 1751, conceivably be brought to medical attention, and were the physician in the local emergency room to whom the child might be brought were to see scattered bruises, a subdural hematoma, a fractured femur, and had that person the foresight or the vision or the computer capability to have read the Kemp and colleagues' 1962 paper, The Battered Child Syndrome, there might be concern about whether or not this child is a victim of the battered child syndrome. Now, I point this out to you for 3 reasons, or I pose this issue to you for 3 reasons. First, to point out how we're dealing with the modern rediscovery in medical language of an age-old social problem. Kemp and colleagues defined child abuse as a syndrome, the battered child syndrome, presumably associating a set of symptoms with a posited etiology, stipulating that a perpetrator sets out to harm a victim in a particular organized fashion. Second, to point out how then as now, child abuse is often perceived as associated with artifacts of social pathology, and especially with poverty. So as I pointed out, gin is the drink of the poor. This mother is presumably, by dint of living on Gin Lane, alcoholic. But if you look carefully, you can note that she has her left hand in what appears to be a kind of snuff box. Hogarth suggests that there may be another psychoactive substance here at play as well. But the depiction I want to emphasize is of a family, is of a tragedy involving poverty and perceived social degradation. But third, I want to point out, and if there is a single concept that you leave this lecture with today, it's the following: that Hogarth here offers us an alternative conceptualization for the problem of child abuse to the notion of intentionality that's built into the concept battered child syndrome of child or child abuse. Those latter diagnostic tags stipulate a situation in which you've got a perpetrator who sets out in an intentional way to harm a defenseless child or to withdraw necessary care from a child. Hogarth here, however, suggests that what may be more fundamentally at issue is not this mother's intention to harm this child, who is soon going to be injured, but rather it's her capacity to protect this child which is more centrally at issue. And he gives us here some tantalizing clues to what might be going on associated with this mother's ability to protect her child. For example, he shows us that the child is tumbling over a broken banister. He suggests that there's an environmental risk here. Obviously, the mother's drunk. There may be something in her use of whatever substances is in this little container that may also adversely affect her capacity to protect the child. But note as well that Hogarth also shows us that this mother has what appeared to be lacerations and abrasions, perhaps, on her leg and on her forehead. He gives us reason to wonder, could this woman herself be a victim of violence? Indeed, in our emergency room today, if you see a child who is injured, along with a mother who is injured, Gary will agree that one's first thought is this a battered woman whose child may also be abused or neglected, something that we are now seeing with fair frequency in clinical practice. Indeed, in today's characterization, this could be seen as a homeless woman and child, and I'll mention that in this context as well, because the studies of homeless women and children in Massachusetts and elsewhere suggest an important prevalence of victimization experience in the mothers' lives. In Ellen Bassick's study reported in AJPH a few years ago of sheltered Massachusetts children and families, approximately 40% of the homeless women, if asked, would tell you that they were in flight from violent relationships themselves. So I want you to keep in mind this concept of the protection of the child as an alternative to the notion of intentionality as I talk, because I think it provides a more useful clinical handle to organize the data in practice, and it guides a more compassionate intervention, especially in pediatric interviewing, where if one keeps in view the possibilities that what may be at issue is not any intention on the part of the parent to harm a child, one will ask about that parent's experience, that parent's relationship with that child, as opposed to pursuing the notion of a perpetrator who harms a child by a systematic method in which very frequently the interview will immediately become oppositional and conflictful. Now, just to bring the concept home a little bit and in a humorous way, I want to, and actually if the projectionist can hear, I would appreciate it if this light could be either dimmed or turned out, because pardon me? Oh, you need it for the video. I beg your pardon. Well, folks on TV, I'm glad to see you. Here you see the depiction of this concept of protection by another artist, in this case an American, Rube Goldberg, the cartoonist whose delightful contraptions to complicate the simple tasks of everyday life charmed a generation of Americans. And here you see how Rube Goldberg enabled this father, awakened in the middle of the night by this crying baby, to protect the baby from his angry feelings, symbolized by this gun, which, as you can see, is discharging as part of the machine, but the bullet's not going to harm the child. I'll just waste a moment of your time and tell you the legend that Rube Goldberg gave for this is quite delightful. He always had, with these contraptions, a legend which began, "The professor says," and tells you how to work the machine, and this is how to work the machine. The professor says, "Pull the string A and it discharges the pistol B, and the bullet C hits the switch on the electric stove D. This heats up the milk in the pot E, and the vapor from the warmed milk melts the wax on the melts the wax on the candle F, which drips down and causes the pot to spill warmed milk down this trough G into this can H. And as you can see, that activates this little seesaw contraption I, and it pulls the nursing nipple at the end of this long straw K into the baby's mouth, at the same time that this string J pulls a perch on which sit two pet crows, L and M, who perceive a rubber worm, N, which they begin to eat. But unable to masticate it, they pull it back and forth so the cradle will be rocked and the baby will go back to sleep. And then the cartoonist goes on to say, "Put cotton in your ears so you won't be bothered if the baby wakes again." This is a one-shot only device to protect a baby from a father's angry feelings. Now, you can tell I'm really concerned to bring home to you this concept of protection. At the same time, I'm also concerned in the course of a lecture on child abuse to some extent to buffer us from some of the awfully sad and raging feelings which these cases may stimulate. And when you give a lecture on such a serious topic, it's sometimes helpful to have a little bit of humor, and I'll try to do that in a tasteful way as I proceed. Now, I want to present you a children's hospital case, which several people in the room were involved in, actually.